What is unitary executive theory? Well, you've heard Reinhold talk a little bit about it here on the show, and today I'm talking to, look, I love Reinhold, but he's no constitutional lawyer, right? And we have someone who is training to be one. His name is Ryan Silverstein. He's a JD candidate at Villanova University and a fellow with Villanova's McCullen Center for Law, Religion, and Public Policy. And his work has appeared in the New York Daily News, Real Clear Politics, and the Detroit News. And he wrote an article called A Gift to the Conservative Legal Movement, over at the Daily Wire, talking about the firing of Gwen Wilcox, the former chair of the National Labor Relations Board, and she's suing Donald Trump because she was fired. She was appointed by Biden. Trump comes in, and she said that he doesn't have the power to fire her. So does the president have the power to hire and fire members of the executive branch? Well, Ryan argues he does, and he explains why. So stay tuned as we talk with Ryan Silverstein here on the Chris Spangle Show. Ryan Silverstein, thanks so much for being my guest today.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
Now, I told you in the pre-interview, I've got this co-host, Reinhold. And now I have no idea what you think about the unitary executive theory, but he has talked a lot about this on the show in the past. So I'm really interested for you to kind of go into it. But, you know, there's so much happening in Washington, D.C. and executive power that this is a really exciting conversation to have. But let's kind of set the table. So you wrote this article about Gwen Wilcox being fired by President Trump. And at the heart of this is, does the president have the power to fire people in the executive branch? Correct?
Yes.
Okay. So what happened to poor Miss Wilcox? Tell us her story.
So Gwen Wilcox, she was named chair of the National Labor Relations Board by President Biden in mid-December, December 2024. And for a lot of people, that's like a lifetime career achievement. Like, you've been appointed by the president to head an independent agency responsible for protecting workers' rights, right? That's a really big deal, and it's really prestigious to have. Now, President Trump, he came into office and in early January, mid-January, and he wants to, how do I frame this?
Fire a bunch of people?
Well, I mean, I say fire a bunch of people, but I think he's trying to cement control over the executive branch, is the way to put it. He's trying to say, I'm the executive, I've been elected by the American people, and therefore I'm going to carry out my mandate. And part of his mandate is kind of reining in the administrative state. He specifically ran on, reining in the unelected bureaucrats who are running the country in Washington. And with Wilcox, I guess she was opposed to the Trump agenda. Maybe he had beef with her in a prior administration. I don't know whatever his personal issue was with her, but I think he fired her because she was a Democrat appointed by Joe Biden in the waning days of his term. And because of that, she was fired from the NLRB, and she sued in response to that. She said, well, no.
The labor law leader got fired and sued over labor law. That's fascinating.
Yeah. So basically, the lady charged with helping enforce labor law, I think there's like five or six commissioners on the NLRB. There's a bunch of commissioners. She heads them. She got fired. And now she's saying, hey, my firing was all my fault because you can't fire me. Why? Because of this very old case called Humphrey's Executor. Humphrey's Executor, it was decided in, I think, 1935 or 1938, but it was a New Deal era case. This is when administrative agencies, the idea of independent agencies were kind of novel. It was like, hey, we need independent agencies to help deal with the complexity of nature, and we don't want them to have to deal with the politics of the average day. So by making them independent, they can use their best judgment to help run the country, regulate the economy. It's why we have things like the NLRB to help enforce workers' rights and do investigations into violations of the National Labor Relations Act in a nonpartisan way. Or again, the Federal Trade Commission, we want there to be a nonpartisan way to investigate antitrust violations. At least that's what the theory was. And in theory, it worked, but in practice, I think Donald Trump and a lot of conservatives, they thought that Humphrey's Executor and its progeny led to an administrative state that was out of touch with the American people.
Yeah, so I mean, as libertarians, the administrative state, it's like, here's my, you tell me where I'm crazy, okay? I like the National Weather Service. As an American, I like that they're telling me right now, literally, that a tornado could be appearing at any moment and feeding that information. I like the stability that the administrative state often brings. but I also didn't vote for the administrative state, and I have very little control as a voter in the United States over it. And so you have a president like Barack Obama that comes in and appoints all of these new czars and all of these new commissions and all of this and grows the size of the administrative state. But we really have no functional control. And that seems to be the main Trump administration. I think Trump's personal theory of this is this person is not loyal to me, which I think is a completely separate issue and problem that I have with Donald Trump, versus more the conservative legal movement's argument that we didn't vote for Gwen. Is that her name?
Yes.
We didn't vote for Gwen Wilcox. Why does she have so much power that's permanent for such a long time?
Yeah, and what's really notable about agencies like the National Labor Relations Board, which again is an independent agency, a lot of the times they don't actually announce rules via the typical Administrative Procedure Act process, which is basically, hey, you have to have a notice of comment period, and then you're subject to specific challenges that you can bring to court. Independent agencies, they usually announce their rules via an arbitration process, which means once there's been an arbitration, arbitration adjudication. Once you've been kind of through that internal adjudication process, then you kind of have to appeal to a circuit court, and they usually, historically they deferred, but that might be starting to change because Chevron has been overturned. But still, you have these agencies that don't even have to go through the proper process to promulgate rules. Instead, they can go through this adjudicative process and kind of circumvent that, which is a whole nother problem entirely. So I think this is kind of a good way to transition to what unitary executive theory is, because I think it's important to dispel some of the notions about it. There's this idea that unitary executive theory...
Well, first define it for us, please.
Sure. Unitary executive theory is the idea that the executive has complete control over the entire executive branch. Why? Because he is the sole person vested with the executive power in Article 2, and therefore all agencies which exercise executive power are doing so at the behest of the president, the guy who holds that power.
Right. So, but a lot of these agencies are created by the legislative branch, correct? Like,
yes,
the EPA. So, constitutionally, because you're studying to be a constitutional lawyer, I assume?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm not. So, the legislative branch creates something like the EPA, for example, and that may be a bad example because I think Nixon kind of made that one up out of thin air. But, and then does generally Congress in their legislation outline what the parameters are, and then dictates to the president, like, here are the parameters that you are to execute this, or is it just up to the president to create these agencies? Like, how does that work? And I'm sure it's a patchwork, but in general, kind of where are we at in terms of the dance between the legislative and executive branches in the administrative state?
So there is this very old doctrine. It's called the non-delegation doctrine. The idea being Congress is the only body given the legislative power. And because of that, they can't give their power to anybody else. They're not allowed to delegate their power. What they are allowed to do is give some guardrails, to give some guardrails that the president should follow. It's called the intelligible principle test. Like, hey, so long as there's an intelligible principle here, the legislation is good, doesn't violate the non-delegation doctrine. So if you get it can be very ambiguous, but you also want to avoid being too specific, because if you're too specific, you might also inadvertently delegate power that's yours to the executive branch. Now, how this relates to administrative agencies is really, really simple. Yes, Congress has the power to create and destroy those branches, and they have the power to kind of outline what the scope of these agencies are. But does that mean they have the power to restrict removal power over those agencies, or that the president can't enact rules or policies when those agencies are acting at his behest? And a lot of unitary executive theorists, they say no for a few reasons. The main one being Congress may have created the agency, but they've charged the executive with running that agency and governing that and running that agency in a manner of which he was elected. That's how you hold these bureaucrats accountable. Now, I do want to specifically talk about removal, because removal is a really interesting part of the unitary executive theory.
Meaning the president firing someone like Gwen Wilcox.
Yes, exactly. Removal is really interesting because there are some powers that aren't disputed. Like, for example, it's been known for a long time, literally since 1789, that the president can remove members of the cabinet at will and superior officers of the United States. That was called the decision of 1789. Now, why was this decision made? Really easy, because the Constitution doesn't actually give the president removal power. So the question is, if the president doesn't explicitly have the removal power, where does he get this removal power from? And a lot of unitary executive theorists say, well, it's implied from the vesting of the executive power. And frankly, I'm with them.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm with them because if you have the power to fire superior officers at will, if you have the power to fire employees at will, why would you not be allowed to fire someone who is still utilizing executive power? They're not vested with that power. Only the president is.
So if in the beginning of the country, the president, it was just assumed like this guy's going to have the power to fire his cabinet, where did it evolve? Was it this Humphrey case back in the FDR era that said, no, the president has to be hands off of the civil service, and we can't have the president interfering, and they don't have the power? Was that created by the Supreme Court or court decisions over time?
So it's kind of a mix of both. I mean, we didn't actually see independent agencies created until 1887 during the first progressive era, during the Gilded Age, to start enforcing antitrust law. But this doctrine of the hands-off approach, well, you can't touch the independent agency, that didn't become Supreme Court precedent until Humphrey's executor in 1935, where the court kind of created this test called if the agency wields quasi-judicial and quasi-legislative power, which is basically code for, hey, they're doing some rulemaking things or they're doing some adjudications, therefore we want them to be independent. Even though that doesn't really track, because is that agency also vested with legislative or judicial power? No. Article 3 vests the Supreme Court with the judicial power, and Article 1 vests Congress with the judicial power. So why are we suddenly delegating power to an agency and using that to justify why they're independent from the executive? It doesn't really make sense.
So tell us a little bit about Morrison v. Olson. How does this come in, especially Justice Scalia's dissent in that?
Yeah, so Morrison v. Olson it created an even more functionalist test, and it expanded the scope of Humphreys, right? Humphreys, it really only applied to members of independent agencies. But Morrison, it really expanded the restrictions on removal power to most employees of the United States, because the Supreme Court basically said to Congress, hey, so long as you're not substantially impeding core executive functions, you can impose a restriction on removing employees, which is kind of crazy if you really think about it. Because now suddenly, can Congress impose restrictions on employees via contracting for lower level bureaucrats in the EPA? Yeah, why? That's not blocking core executive functions, is it? Probably not.
Right.
So Scalia, in his dissent, he said, hey, this is really undemocratic. It's going to have bad consequences. It's one of the most iconic dissents in the history of the Supreme Court, and it's really kind of the basis for the modern unitary executive theory. And it's a very good dissent. I highly recommend reading it if you get the chance.
Yeah. I didn't know about it until your article, so I appreciate you pointing it out. Let's go to what feels very chaotic, okay? Let's all just keep in mind that 0.66% of the federal workforce has been let go. It's 20,000 people, and most of those people seem to have been rehired. So I think there's a scope problem here, right? But I think the intent, obviously, of unitary executive theory has been laid bare. We don't want the government to do these functions, and therefore we're going to fire these workforces or do things that actively harm their functions. So hopefully the private sector will pick up those functions. Is that a fair criticism? I mean, that this is I look at this and I go, well, this is kind of like Reinhold's criticisms of this. Trump gets into office and just starts firing people he doesn't like. That is the main criticism of this theory, is that it's going to create this chaotic turnover every 4 years in these agencies that have darn near legislative making power. Is this the best way to really get rid of these agencies?
See, I wouldn't say the president is trying to get rid of agencies. I think he's more so trying to make them smaller and make them, I guess, more efficient, right? I mean, President Trump ran on making the federal government, on making the administrative state more efficient. And that's why he has Elon Musk and the whole Doge project. Now, you do mention the size and scope problem, and to an extent, I can kind of agree that I think the administration doesn't need to stop just taking a big butcher's knife and gutting everything at once. I think they need to be a little more precise in who they're firing. Like, I think they fired some people responsible for overseeing nukes. That's not smart.
People with highly and this is the argument against the unitary executive theory and what Donald Trump is doing. I don't think that, let's say Paul Ryan was president executing this, he would probably do it differently than Donald Trump. The argument for some of these administrative functions is that the private sector is not going to take care of nuclear weapons because it's a function of national security, and therefore non-political people. And I know, like, I don't think like a meteorologist or a guy that works taking care of nuclear weapons wakes up and thinks that much about politics, right? I do think that this, like, Gwen Wilcox probably was appointed for political reasons and is a political operative in some way. But then, like, the nuclear folks that you're talking about, these are highly specialized people that are paid by the federal government to administer something very important for us that you just can't outsource to the private sector. So I think, like, that's the perfect example of, like, all right, what happens when you have an irresponsible executive that can come in and threaten the stability of the system, of these important systems, right? The important systems. Okay, so nobody misunderstands me, Ryan. The important systems, not the unimportant systems, like the National Labor Relations Board. Like maybe there's some important functions, but I don't know. You're going to have to convince me. I think that, to me, is the trepidation of the unified executive theory and the execution and the power that it gives someone to start firing based on political decisions as opposed to trying to be a little more hands-off. Like, how do you respond to that?
Well, I think my first response is more so, it seems to me you're conflating the speed and scope of which the executive action was taken with the entirety of unitary executive theory, which I don't necessarily agree with. I think that, listen, I agree with you. I think
let me make sure I understand your objection, okay?
Yeah.
So you're saying that I am getting wrong that this isn't like true communism. We'd try it better if we did it the right way. Is that like like this isn't true unified executive theory? Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm not saying that's true unified executive theory. Rather, you are conflating the scope, right? The scope of the actions taken and how quickly they were taken with the actual practice of unitary executive. Like, listen, you're totally right. Unitary executive can be super quick like this, and that is a side effect of unitary executive. But I do not think that most people would say, hey, I want the executive to go into the federal government, wield unitary executive, and just willy-nilly fire people. I think what a lot of voters voted for is a president who would go into office and be a little more prudential. So I think you're correct in saying, yeah, there is a prudence problem. But I don't necessarily think that defines unitary executive theory. Rather, I think it shows the cost of unitary executive theory, which sometimes you do get someone who is imprudential, who acts too quickly and doesn't always think about the necessary cost of these services. That's why they hired back those people who were fired, the nuclear workers, for example.
Right.
The problem a lot of unitary executive theorists have isn't necessarily with those people, but it's really these independent agencies that act like they aren't beholden to the president, even though they probably should be beholden to the president.
Yeah, I mean, in a democratic republic, somebody has to be held accountable to the voters, and it is the president. So I guess I don't disagree with that at all. I think it's just like this was a bad start for making the case for some of this, and I think that is a function of Elon Musk and just the way that he thinks and functions, and this is the battle that I have all the time, Ryan, and I appreciate the conversation because it's like, again, that stability and that check and balance seems to be prudent, but also it's completely abused and has to be reined in. So, like, where's that middle? Like, if you were designing this in a better way than maybe it's been executed in the last 3 months, like, what would that process look like?
Well, if I were the president, right? If I were
do it, I'm all for it, man.
If I were the proprietor,
you can't do any worse.
If I were the proprietor of the unitary executive theory, what I would probably do is instead of just saying, hey, start firing people immediately for the shock and awe effect, I would have Elon Musk really do a systematic audit of these departments. For example, the Pentagon has never passed an audit. Why is that? What's going on at the Pentagon? Let's get in there and figure that out before we start firing people.
Yeah.
Or again, what is going on at the Department of Education, right? Why are we giving out these loans to students when they actually can't really afford college? Is there something wrong with the loan process? What's up with loan officers?
Yes. I mean, like the Department of Education, the best argument is that it's become this sanctified like system of perpetual enslavement for students. Like the loans continually roll over, which this again was like Joe. I don't agree with student loan cancellation, but this was the argument that Biden had is like they literally can never pay these off because, you know, and again, like nobody can rein it in except for Congress, which is totally dysfunction. So I know that this kind of goes back to the Bush era, but what is like the origin of this theory and where it came from? Was it because Congress is so dysfunctional and we're unable to actually govern?
So it was people started talking about it. Specifically, Antonin Scalia started talking about during the 1970s and the Nixon administration, and it became very popular during the Reagan administration because they were a little tired of all these embedded bureaucrats who weren't listening to Ronald Reagan, and that's how we got to Morrison v. Olson. Morrison v. Olson was decided in like 1989 because President Reagan wanted to fire an independent counsel because he thought, hey, I'm the president. Why can there be an independent counsel to investigate me when I'm the president?
Yeah. So, I mean, how do you think? What do you think is the most misunderstood aspect of this debate? Because you're presenting like a very rational, laid out, well thought argument. You don't get that very many places. Like, what if you were to sit down with Reinhold and say, like, all right, dude, don't freak out. Here's why this does work, right? Like, what are some of the most misunderstood aspects that you hear frequently in the criticism of this?
I think the most frequent criticism is the idea that unitary executive theory makes the president a king, and that's not true, right? Unitary executive isn't about expanding presidential power beyond Article 2. Rather, it's about expanding the breadth of presidential power over Article 2 officers and people who normally should be subject to the executive branch. So, for example, the president, he recently decided to, he apparently ignored a temporary restraining order by a judge. A unitary executive theorist like myself would say, you can't do that. I may support a strong executive, but I also think that the line is Article 2. Once you're impeding on valid judicial power, that's not correct. The unitary executive only gives you power over executive officers, not members of Congress or members of the judiciary.
I mean, these TROs, like a district court judge, didn't they sort of just invent this power for themselves?
So they did invent it. The first one was done in 1963, but Congress has statutorily now given these judges this power.
Okay.
You can look this up. It's called Federal Rule of Civil Procedure 65.
Look, I like you. You know your stuff. Yeah. So, hold on just a second. I think the idea of the Constitution for most people is a little outdated at this point. But these constitutional debates really do impact people in their daily lives. Like, how do these constitutional debates about that, Gwen going to the Supreme Court and the unitary executive theory and debating these sorts of things, like how does this play out in an average person's life?
I'm going to be straight up. For the most part, these big constitutional debates, like your average steel worker in Pennsylvania or your average farmer in Iowa, they don't really have a big stake in these big arguments. The only people who are really affected are the swamp, the Washington bureaucrats. So the only way you will see it is maybe, for example, the Federal Reserve with interest rates. That might be one where you'll see an impact, and maybe with the NLRB, like with labor unions and how vigorously the NLRB is enforcing the NLRA. Maybe you'll see some impact there, but other than that, I don't think there's going to be this huge impact on average Americans' life besides those two.
Okay. All right. Well, Ryan Silverstein, final thoughts, like outline the case. Let's hear what you have to, the floor is yours. Anything that I forgot to mention, I'd love to hear your thoughts because I think I'm too uneducated to ask you the questions that your deep mind are. I can just tell you're a really smart dude. So like, lay it out for me. What did I miss? What's the answer to the question that I forgot to ask you?
I think you just didn't ask me enough about my response to the technocratic interest. I think the response is we as Americans have to ask ourselves, sure, there's this valid technocratic interest, but after living through COVID and I guess the era of technocrats, we have to ask ourselves, these out-of-touch agencies who issue these rules, who tried to force millions of Americans to receive a vaccine mandate, or who tried to force millions of Americans to wear masks and stay home from schools. We went through this progressive technocratic vision, and has it really succeeded or has it failed the public in some way? And more importantly, does that technocratic interest outweigh the democratic cost of unitary executive theory? That's a question for your audience to ponder.
All right. Great question. And thank you so much, Ryan. If people want to follow your work, where can they do that?
Yeah, you guys can follow me on Twitter at RyanRyan916. You can follow me on LinkedIn at Ryan Silverstein.
All right, Ryan. Thanks so much for spending your time with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.